This episode openly discusses the topic of mental health and well-being. Please be kind to yourself if you feel the discussion is likely to trigger you, and please skip this episode if doing so will safeguard your own mental health. The content of this episode is not medical advice and is not intended to be a substitute for therapy from a qualified professional. We would encourage you to seek support and professional advice and/or therapy if you are struggling with your own mental health. Take care out there, everyone. This week, I want to discuss the tabletop games that we love in a slightly different context than the painting and review videos you usually see on our channel. Specifically, I want to talk about tabletop games in the context of mental health. This is a complicated and nuanced topic, and being neither a medical professional nor a scientific researcher in the field, I can't claim authority on it as a topic. However, I think it is something that our community needs to get better at discussing more openly. Scientific research is increasingly finding evidence for the health benefits associated with board games that many of us have suspected for some time. A recent review of studies by Norder et al. Looking at the effectiveness of intervention with board games is a particularly interesting read if you have the time. It discusses evidence to suggest that board games can increase attention and working memory in those suffering from cognitive decline or living in nursing homes, as well as being a valuable tool for encouraging learning and improving the motivation of the players. There is even some evidence that playing board games can have a role in the prevention of conditions such as Alzheimer's disease or contribute to improvements in ADHD symptoms in children. Many such studies focus on very traditional board games such as chess or Go, but personally I'd be surprised if the effects described are limited to such games. I've seen in my own children how board games can increase interest and engagement in learning. For example, thematic games like Mythic Battles' Pantheon can increase interest in history or mythology, and many games stealthily improve understanding of mathematical concepts such as probability. And honestly, the scientific conclusions won't come as a surprise to anyone saturated in the hobby. Whilst we might not use the language of science to describe it, many of these things form part of the reason we play, and, at least in part, explain why tabletop games have become so popular. I couldn't quantify the precise health benefits of board games, nor am I in any way qualified to predict their effect on the condition of others, but I know from personal experience that playing games can have an extremely beneficial effect on personal well-being. We tend to shy away from sharing personal details on the channel, anonymity being something that is very important to us. We hope you will judge us by our content rather than our history or our faces, but it is only appropriate if we are to destigmatize conversations about mental health and well-being that I start by sharing a little of my own experience. For much of my life, I have dealt with personal depression. It's not something that I talk about very openly, even to my own family, but at the same time I don't think it's a confession that would surprise those that know me. Professionally, I've always been able to lead meetings, argue with business colleagues, and I'm considered pretty assertive, but my personal life has often been a very different story. A few years back, personal circumstances in my life were such that my mental health took a more severe turn for the worst, and I started to suffer from anxiety and panic attacks. I also suffered physical symptoms related to my mental health issues such as tension headaches and what I now suspect was IBS. It's easy to forget when you are in that place just how insidious mental health issues can be. Depression, for example, creeps and claws at the edges of your consciousness. It slowly, drip by drip, persuades you of a view of the world that may not be entirely real, but nevertheless feels impossible to escape from. All too easily, it becomes a giant rock that you are forced to carry wherever you go that affects every part of your life. Even the strongest of people can quickly find themselves retreating from friends and family, experiencing feelings of low self-worth and despair. Once the spiral begins, it is not only difficult to escape, but it's difficult to believe that escape is even possible. I am fortunate to be able to say that I'm in a much better place today than I was back then. I suspect that depression will always be a condition I will have to manage, but I rarely suffer from anxiety, and I've grown better at recognising the signs of a deterioration in my mental health, seeing it clearly for what it is, and I have strategies to help me manage how I feel. Tabletop games were not the only factor in the improvement that I've seen in my life. I've been lucky to have a supportive family and some truly outstanding friends who have been willing to help me shoulder the burden, to be there for me at times of need, so that I can find my centre again. But my hobby did play a part in that improvement, and I think that is worth sharing in the hope it may help others also. When I was at my lowest point, I was advised by medical professionals to seek the company of others and to generally get out of the house more. On the face of it, this seemed an impossible task. At the time, I suffered from crippling social anxiety and found it very difficult to reach out to people. Luckily, I was well enough to be able to recognise that something had to change, and to help motivate that change, I turned to a side of the hobby I had neglected for some time. I found a game freshly released that I had an interest in, and signed up for a tournament in another city, my first real experience playing tabletop games with other human beings in about 5 years. My social anxiety was on an all-time high, but there is something about the structure of a gaming event that I found and still find is greatly supportive of that. For starters, nobody knew me at the venue in question, so if I really couldn't face it and backed out at the last moment, then nobody would think anything of it. In that sense, it was low risk, albeit still terrifying. I arrived at the venue with 15 other people who all had interest in the game in common, and were all there for the same purpose. Randomly selected opponents meant I didn't have the awkwardness of finding someone to play, and if I didn't know what to talk about, I could just talk about the game and not seem even slightly strange. And I did talk. Not about anything heavy or important, but I talked. I had the opportunity to speak to the creators of the game, which I thought was pretty amazing. In this regard, tabletop games have an almost unique capability when it comes to issues such as anxiety, loneliness, and detachment. As handcrafted connection-forming machines, they bypass many of the things that I personally find difficult about social situations. Of course, we should never have to be afraid to speak openly about mental health issues or feel that we have to conceal our emotions. That notwithstanding, in my personal case, I have found that sometimes a brief respite from real-life issues by immersing myself in another setting and focusing on something inconsequential can provide the headspace I need to break out of negative spirals of thought. I lost all but one of my games and enjoyed, despite myself, every second of the experience. When I got home, I signed up for the very next competitive event for said game that I could find. As it was a relatively new and niche game, I had to travel some distance, but I didn't mind that. In fact, the further away from my normal life I had to go, the better. After a few such events, I found familiar faces started to appear. People I'd met at previous events were pleased at the opportunity to play against me again. Possibly because I was so bad at the game, but I'll take it. We'd take lunch as a group, share tactics, share precious victories and dramatic defeats. Having something to look forward to and having a reason to get up and go somewhere and socialise with others made a big difference to my health on a number of levels. It had a knock-on effect on more meaningful social relationships, where I slowly felt more confident in sharing my thoughts and anxieties with trusted friends more openly. Most importantly, it helped me to see my mental health issues for what they were and start to address them in other ways. It's Mental Health Awareness Week in the UK, and the focus of this year is that of loneliness. We all have our own balances when it comes to interaction with other people, some of us preferring our own company much of the time, whilst others among us thrive on social interaction and suffer quickly and deeply without it. However, I don't think it a stretch to suggest that most of us need contact with other human beings in a social context to some degree, or our mental health suffers. The global pandemic over the past 2 years has placed limits on our ability to see loved ones and interact with friendship groups, but more than that, it has made social interaction a much more anxious prospect for many of us than it was before. Playing tabletop games is not a magic bullet to solve social anxiety, depression, loneliness, or any other mental health conditions, but I hope my experience illustrates the role such a hobby can play in providing a structure for social interaction that takes some of the anxiety out of reaching for the company of strangers. For me, it took away one of the barriers that prevented me from addressing my mental health, from reaching out when I needed support. Now, there's a good chance that you already know this from your own experience. You are, after all, watching a video on a channel predominantly designed to celebrate tabletop gaming, so you probably have at least some knowledge of the hobby. So here is my challenge to you. Reach out to someone this week and ask them to play a game, whether in a social setting, in your own home, or remotely. Share your experience of the hobby with someone else that isn't part of your usual tabletop crowd, especially if you think that someone else might be finding it hard to reach out themselves. Be gentle and respectful in doing so. It may be that said person isn't ready or interested at that moment in time. You certainly shouldn't take offence if the offer is declined. But the very act of reaching out to another human being and saying, "This is fun, I'd love it if you'd come and share this fun with me," has value and makes a difference. We'd love to hear your own experiences with mental health issues in the comments if you feel able, though we'd ask that you be sensitive in your phrasing if you think your comments have the potential to be triggering to others. Lastly, we love hearing from our viewers, but we're no substitute for professional support if that's something you feel might help you personally. If you're struggling with your mental health, whether that means loneliness, anxiety, or something different altogether, please know that there are many ways in which you can seek support and help depending on your situation. There are many charities devoted to providing support if you need it, even if that support is just being able to pick up the phone and speak to someone in a non-judgmental, neutral capacity. How you feel is, of course, unique to you, but that doesn't mean that you have to face it alone. We will include a link to the Mental Health Foundation website in the description below, where you can read about many projects designed to address loneliness, find resources that may be of help to you, or donate money to worthy causes if you so choose. We can't hope to provide a link for every country outside of the UK, however a quick Google search will likely reveal an equivalent organisation for your area. I hope you have found this video interesting or useful or inspiring. As always, work hard and play better, but above all else, take care out there.